Hi, I am Sarah Rodman, the TV editor here at the Los Angeles Times. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so pleased to have in our continuing series of Feud thespians with us today, Mr. Alfred Molina. Thank you so much for joining us
It's
today,
a pleasure.
sir.
Thank you very much.
So I have 1,000 questions about this show.
Let's get started because
So
I don't have a
know.
lot of time.
I know we have a limited amount of time, so I probably won't get to them all. And we also have some questions on Twitter and Facebook as well. But Jackie Hoffman was here and Susan Sarandon was here.
Oh, fantastic.
And what I
I'm very happy with my billing. That's very nice.
Yeah, that's
Very
not bad.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Third down on the list. But I was pleased to hear, and we were actually just talking about that. Even though the idea of the show was very sort of vitriolic and acidic, that the vibe on the set was actually quite lovely and fun. And in between sort of slinging insults at each other and you and Stanley Tucci swearing up a storm at each other, that in between takes that like everybody was getting along.
Yeah, very much so. And I think, as we were saying, I think there's a mood and a tone that gets set from the very top. People, the showrunners, the writers, the directors, and so on. And that actually creates a kind of atmosphere and it just trickles down, and people respond to that. And also the fact that the work was very interesting for a start. None of us were being required to do anything that was kind of dull in any way or questionable in any way. So that also helps. When you're working on quality material, it kind of helps to keep the wheels kind of greased, as it were. But it was a very harmonious set. And I think also another reason was that there were lots of relationships and friendships inside. The crew had worked with Ryan before on other projects. Some of the actors had worked with some members of the crew before. I'm Stanley Tucci and I are friends, old friends from many years ago. I knew Jackie a little bit from working at the same time, not in the same show, but working at the same time on Broadway with her. And so on and so forth. So there was a nice atmosphere. We were all kind of, I felt at least, happy to be there and happy to be going to work. So, and that's all grist to the mill.
So it was easy to turn on the anger.
Well, it's a lot easier when you're having to act it than if you're sitting there kind of seething about someone, and then you have to seethe about them, professionally. It's kind of it's not quite the same thing.
Exactly. And everybody talks about Jessica and Susan because obviously they are the top billed people here. They are the stars here. But I want to talk about your and Stanley's relationship as Jack Warner and Robert Aldrich, because to me, those were some of the most crackling scenes in the show. And I get the sense from the little bit of research that I've done, but I'm sure you did much more, that was pretty accurate to what their relationship was like. They were not friends. They were combative but symbiotic.
Absolutely, yeah. That's absolutely the case. There was Robert was a journeyman director. He'd gone through almost every genre. He's done westerns, war movies, love stories, comedies, horror. And when Baby Jane arrived, the possibility of doing whatever happened to Baby Jane arrived, his career, like the careers of Joan Crawford and Bette Davis, were in very much of a slump. He hadn't had a hit movie. His last 3 movies had been flops. He was finding it hard to get a movie made. He was having to go back to work in television, and this was in the days when TV was not nearly as prestigious or as quality as it is now. This was in the days when Hollywood certainly regarded TV as the place where actors and directors went to die. It was like, that's where you went when your career in movies was over.
Now it's where you go to thrive.
Absolutely, because it's kind of taken the place of sort of, it's taken the place of low budget filming, independent films. All those people, they're all working in television now. We are going through, I think, a kind of golden age of TV.
Absolutely.
But in those days, it was very, very different. And so Robert and Betty and Joan were all desperate for something. And so, as you say, that the relationship was symbiotic, and particularly with Jack Warner, who had very little respect for Robert, but saw here a chance to make some money from what was relatively very little investment. And so Robert was kind of caught, I believe, in between this strange place where I don't think he was relishing the idea of stoking the fire of this rivalry between Joan and Betty, but at the same time, he understood that it was going to create buzz, it was going to create publicity, and that was all going to be good for the film.
Right. It was going to help him get
Yeah.
the film made and get
and
an
ultimately for
audience
the three of
it.
them, that was their primary objective, was to get the movie made,
Right.
and make as good a movie as possible. So he's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
And several rocks at hard places. He's got Jack Warner, he's got Betty, he's got Joan, and he's got his wife.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, your character is the character with the most problems.
In a way. But Robert, in a sense, I mean, he created a lot. He created a lot of those problems, I believe. Also, because he belongs to a generation of men in the film business, who, in a sense, were pretty much allowed to just behave any way they wanted. They certainly weren't answerable to any women in positions of authority. There were no studio heads who were women. There were no producers who were women. Very few, but certainly weren't not those in a position to kind of call the shots. So his generation, I think, had a level of entitlement and a level of privilege that they probably weren't even aware of, because it would never have occurred to them to think in terms of privilege or entitlement.
Right. It's just the way that it was, and sadly, to some extent, the way it still is.
It'd be interesting to make a movie now about a man like that in today's film world.
Exactly. What
Because
would Robert Aldrich? How would he deal with 2017 filmmaking?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it would be a huge road.
Well, he probably would have been surprised by how things worked just on the Feud set.
Yeah.
And how much sort of women were in charge of that.
I thought one of the interesting elements of that particular thread was the scene when Alison Wright's character, Pauline, comes to me and suggests that she might direct this movie that she's written, and with no side. And no kind of judgment when he says I can't remember the exact line, but he says something like, women don't direct films, no one's done that. And he didn't say it in any way that was mean. It was just a fact. It was like saying, well, water's wet,
Right, exactly.
Because that was such an unknown thing. That was and it was revolutionary to have a character. I mean, I think it's a wonderful thread in the story.
Yes.
Alison Wright's character, the way she, and that fantastic scene when she's describing what her dream is to Mamacita, and Mamacita is explaining, if that's what you want to do, then this is what's got to happen.
Right.
This kind of sense of understanding, not just of what happens in the film world, but also what happens in the world
in the real
general.
world.
It's really some lovely writing.
And that storyline was so great too, because it wasn't just you, because we have the expectation that the world is that way. But then she goes to Joan Crawford specifically, who doesn't change out of her house dress, is incredibly disrespectful of the idea. I mean, even the women treat her with that kind of, and it's not even contempt, isn't the right word, but it's just like, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to spend my time.
But because of
this.
the way things were back then, I would imagine that a lot of women would have acted out of fear rather than any kind of contempt, because a fear of losing what they perceived as what they had.
Right.
And I think that's something that's often not taken into consideration whenever we're at a point in history when there's a seismic change, when there's a real kind of moral and social moment where things are really going to change, that a lot of people resist it, not out of disagreement, but just out of fear that, well, where does that leave me, or where does that leave us?
I have this little piece already. You can't take this little piece.
Yeah.
If you succeed, some of my little piece is going to go.
That's right. It might be a tiny piece, but it's mine.
Right.
And that's a hard thing to negotiate.
But it's so interesting too, because in the film, after Baby Jane is so successful, you end up, Robert Aldrich as a character ends up, going on to being a really successful director. Even Dirty Dozen, Longest Yard, a real favorite of mine, The Frisco Kid, which was a later film for him, but Gene Wilder and Harrison Ford, a great film if you haven't seen it. And he shows up and gives Betty Davis an ashtray. So
that's right.
He wins a career and she wins an ashtray.
Yeah, that's right. But also Betty's career carried on. I mean, she carried on making movies. Joan less so, but there was certainly, to varying degrees, there was life after Baby Jane for all of them. Although it's interesting how, when you look at some of the later moments in Betty's life, particularly as she got older, she became less less of a kind of vital artist and more of a sort of, she was like an institution somehow,
Right.
you know, that she'd get, you know, she was still alive and she was still smoking like a chimney and drinking and being outrageous, and that became like why you wanted her. Let's get Betty Davis on the show because she's hilarious. You know.
Right. She'll rip off some one-liners.
Yeah, and there was but at least it meant that, you know, that they had lives, professional lives after that, which was kind of, you know, which was good, I think.
Now, had you been big fans of their filmography before you started this
Yeah,
project?
I'd seen quite a bit of their movies. I mean, in the usual course of things, certainly Betty's films, and I didn't know very much about. I knew about Robert Aldrich's later career because, you know, after I loved Baby Jane. I'd seen, you know, Dirty Dozen and Ulzana's Raid and all those movies, and I was interested because he was working with people who were very current in those periods. You know, he was working with big stars, and but I knew very little about his movie career prior to whatever happened to Baby Jane. But they are figures. They are figures that are very important in the history of the industry, and if you are, you know, any serious student or enthusiast for that history is bound to come across their work, you know, time and time again. But particularly, I mean, I think, again, this is just my opinion, but I think Joan Crawford has always been somewhat underestimated as an actor. I think she suffered probably in the same way that young actresses do now, where they become, in a sense, victims of their beauty.
Right.
And you know, sort of trapped, kind of trapped in this beautiful ghetto, where, you know, you can't, no one's going to take you seriously outside of that, because what you are, the way you look, or whatever it is so much part of what makes you interesting, or what people perceive as the best part of you. Betty, not so much, because Betty was never quite a conventional beauty, although that she is beautiful, but she was never quite that conventional thing. And there's that fantastic moment in one of the episodes when they confront that need, that symbiotic need, that thing that keeps them apart but binds them forever. You know, when she says, "What was it like being the most beautiful girl on earth?"
She says,
And
"What
she
was
goes,
it like being the most talented?"
Yeah, and they both have the same answer. You know,
Yeah.
it was never enough. It's never enough.
Lonely.
Yeah, and that's such a classic, and that's a dilemma that actors in Hollywood, actresses particularly, are constantly fighting against. You know, and so for all the groundwork that's been made, for all the changes we see here and there, you know, more women directors, more women writers, more women. That's all wonderful, but I think one of the points of Feud was that actually nothing has changed that much.
Yes.
You know, nothing has changed that much.
Shockingly.
Yeah.
In a very long period of time. In the period of time that has essentially been your career.
Yeah.
And that you have had, I mean, so many great opportunities. And I think that this is such a good part for you, because it occurred to me, and I don't know if this was part of the allure for you, but you talk about how he did all of those things. You've done all of those things too. As an actor, you have done, you know, absurd comedy, legit Broadway stage, very serious drama, musicals. I mean, you've done everything too, the way that he did too. And I was wondering if that was sort of a kinship that you felt to him.
I think, yeah, partly. I think there's certainly a kind of there's a camaraderie, I must admit, amongst people who have done a bit of everything. Because 9 times out of 10, that's not the way. We don't plan it that way.
Right.
You know, I mean, I always think, you know, when I talk with young actors who ask me things like, how do you plan a career? My answer is always, you don't. A career is something you look back on. A career is something you turn back, you kind of go, oh, I did this and this. And if you've had a bit of luck and a bit of good fortune along the way, if you've managed to play some nice parts here and there, you look back on your so-called career and you'll see a sort of crazy quilt of all kinds of different things. And no one plans it like that. I mean, I remember being very young as an actor. In my final year at drama school, we would sit around and talk about what our dreams were. And people were saying things like, you know, I want to play all the clowns in Shakespeare before I'm 35, or I want to play Hamlet before I'm 29. You know, we had all these kind of grandiose sort of
Right.
dreams about what we wanted to do, and I would go along with that and kind of go, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So what was your dream back
Well,
then?
truly my dream was to to be in a Western. You know, that was I was thinking, yeah, but I want to be in a Western.
You just wanted to ride a horse.
You know, I want to ride a horse. I want to be a gangster in a movie. You know, and so I just said yes to everything. I mean, anything that came along, I said yes to.
And you've played this wide spectrum of races and religions, and I mean, you have played a lot of foreigners.
Yeah, it's true. I remember years ago, I remember doing an interview for a newspaper in England, and someone described me as giving good foreign. You know? He gives really good foreign. Thank you very much. But I think, but even that's changing now, and I think for the good. I think that the days of white Caucasian actors taking it for granted
That they can be Iranian.
if there's a part of an Arab character or a Jewish character or that you can just do it because you happen to do the act. I mean, I was told once by an agent years and years ago that he said you're never going to be in Merchant Ivory films, Fred. You're never going to play a romantic lead. You just don't have the looks. You don't have the body for it.
Oh my God! I hope he's not still your agent.
But he was right. He was right. No, he's not my agent anymore. But he was right. What he said, what your strength is, you are ethnically ambiguous.
Yes.
That was his phrase, ethnically ambiguous. He said, you could be Spanish, you could be Italian. I said, well, I am Spanish and I am Italian. I said, but you could be Jewish, you can be Arabic, you could be, you can be all sorts. You could be Greek, and that's...
You've been all of those things.
I've been all those things. So he was right. But the thing is, there's an advantage to that in the sense that I kind of, there was a point where, I'd read a breakdown. They say, there'd be a part described as Eastern European thug. And I'd kind of go,
Sign me up.
sign me up, But so now, 45 years later, I'm looking back now, I kind of go, oh, did I do all that? And I'm kind of proud of it because not because it was necessarily work of any great quality or anything like that. That's not where the pride comes from. The pride is that I wasn't precious about it. I went for things because it sounded interesting, and it paid the bills, and and it kind of. Got a couple of kids through college. That's
That is always key.
Yeah.
But I mean, but the spectrum is big. I mean, the distance between Robot Chicken and Drunk History, and Raiders of the Lost Ark and Chocolat and Fiddler on the Roof and Art. I mean, that's like a big spectrum.
Yeah.
I mean, so. I
If
think
you
that
say so.
I think that the pride should also be in the work too. But I have to ask before we start taking questions from the audience, what is the key to nailing an American accent? Because you've done it so many times now. Are there tricks that you sort of get into when you get a role to get into that space?
I don't know. This is where I don't mean to sound in any way self-aggrandizing, but I think I've always had a pretty good ear for accents, and I think it's because both my parents had accents. And I grew up in London in a kind of working class immigrant neighborhood. And so there were lots of, and when I went to school, when I was at primary school, from like first grade up to fifth or sixth grade, I think it's here, all my schoolmates were like me. They were first generation kids from parents who'd emigrated. And so there was Spanish kids, Italian kids, Greek, Portuguese kids, West Indian kids, Irish kids. And the thing that we all had in common was that we were all in this Catholic parochial school. And so the parents of all these kids, and some of the kids themselves, had really strong accents. And in the street, at home, in the neighborhood, I just heard these accents all the time. Plus, in those days, in the late 50s, early 60s, on British TV, a good 60% maybe of the product was American. Oh. So we grew up with, all the big hit Western shows, the cop shows. And I can remember playing in the street as a kid playing, cops and robbers and cowboys and Indians, and we would do accents that we'd stole.
So you've been practicing.
We'd be running around kind of going, you got me, copper, or head him off at the pass, This
So
town
you
ain't
were-
big enough for the two of us.
You were preparing your whole life. For those opportunities.
Yeah, we were doing all of that, and it was this kind of, it was just those sounds were in the air, and also I think as well was a great love of American music as I was growing up. I mean, British pop bands sang with American accents. I want to hold your hand. I mean, and then falling in love with American music. With my big passion in those days was I was very snooty. If it wasn't on, it had to be on the Motown, Stax, Atlantic, or Chess labels.
Well, at least you had good taste, my
If it
friend.
if it
Good for
wasn't-
you.
If it wasn't on those labels, I wasn't interested. I was terribly snooty. I mean, we were kind of it was sort of, and the more obscure stuff.
Absolutely.
I got a new single by Barbara Hale, and if all my friends kind of went, "Who's she?" I'd go, "Yeah."
That's a winner.
No
Have
one's
you
heard
been
of
to
it,
the
yeah.
Stax Museum in Memphis?
No, never.
You have to go.
I want to go.
It
I
is
wanna go.
remarkable. Stax and Son in Memphis. If you're a fan of that stuff, it is holy.
Yeah.
Going to those
So
places.
that was, so the accent was kind of, I think, was just always around, So although the first time I ever played an American character on stage, I went and had some coaching because the character had to be specifically from New York. Because he refers to himself as being from New York, so I couldn't have just gone in and sort of doing some nondescript thing. So but then I got, it's come relatively easy, but not because of any innate skills of mine. I've just had a lucky set of circumstances.
And a good ear, because there are some of your countrymen and women that struggle more than you do, and every once in a while you're like, oh, and you don't know them, and they're British. Hear that? All right, let's take a few
They're
questions.
not getting my work, are they? Don't let them get any my work.
Right, exactly. It's a good thing. More work for you. All right, Mark on Twitter wants to know, did you have a favorite Robert Aldrich movie? And you already sort of addressed that you did some research into him.
Yeah,
So did you have a favorite one?
Well, I tell you, a favourite of mine. There were two actually. One, of course, was Baby Jane. Another one was slightly later, The Longest Yard, which in England was released as, I think it was called Mean Machine or The Mean Machine, and that was I loved that movie, and Dirty Dozen was another great movie, but certainly. Baby Jane and Longest Yard, and also the reason I like those two in particular is because they're so different in terms of style and tone. I mean, he was a very skillful director, I believe, and given the technology at the time, and you look at those movies now, and you can be forgiven for kind of thinking, the special effects are a little hokey. They're a bit, that's obviously not a real explosion, but the thing is. That was the technology that was available, and audiences kind of would have thrilled to that just as much as we do now to things that have the benefit of millions of dollars of CGI and special effects and stuff.
In-camera effects. It was what all you had back then.
Yeah.
Libby on Facebook would like to know if you could join another Ryan Murphy series, which one would you join?
Ooh. I think, well, it's over now, but it was one of my favorites, was Nip Tuck. I would have loved to have done that.
It seems like you did. Are you sure you didn't?
I didn't do Nip Tuck. No.
Because you're also one of those people that has a very close to a full set of Law and Orders. You have SVU and Trial by Jury.
Yeah, and
LA.
Law and Order. But I never did the Mothership.
Right.
I never did the original, which was one of my dreams, and it was really funny because when I was doing a play on Broadway in 96, 97 like that, and one of the head writers from Law and Order came to see the play and came backstage afterwards to say hello, and when he told me who he was, I said, "Oh, I love Law and Order. I love Law and Order." Yeah. And it was all I could do not to say, "Can I be in it?" I mean, it was like, but I was dropping every hint possible. I love that show. That's just the kind of show that I think is really important. I was dropping every hint.
And I'm right here in New York, right now.
Yeah, right now, and I'm here for a while. There was none of. But then years later, when I did Law and Order LA, I met him again, and he said, "See, I kept my word." I thought, yeah, like 20 years later.
Eventually. Oh my God. Oh, this is an interesting question,
I'll
Carolyn.
be the judge of that.
All right, you're absolutely right. I rescind that it's interesting. Do you see any connection between Baby Jane and Get Out, horror movies that are both popular and works of art?
Interesting.
It was. I'm
yeah,
right.
very interesting. Very interesting. I think there's a similarity in as much as there's a grain of humour that goes through both films. There's a touch of that Grand Guignol kind of style where everything's just a little, the horror or the shock is just a little heightened for, for the kind of, for the thrill factor. Like I think for instance, when Joan builds up to lifting the lid off her lunch, to see her dinner rather, to see this, we set it up with the bird, and then the payoff is the rat. And I think there's a similar kind of build in Get Out with where everything ratchets up each time, and also the way that a certain kind of version of normal life is going on, sort of around all the horrific stuff. But even that feels a little odd. Like in Baby Jane, the sunlight hitting the alleyway that separates the two houses when the neighbor is working on her garden. That sunlight is harsh.
Like it feels wrong.
And it feels kind of threatening. And she's in the dark and behind those bars and so on. And there's the same thing in Get Out when there's that scene when they arrive at her family's house and everyone's really welcoming, but just a little kind of weird.
Just a little too out.
And you kind of go, and it's funny in that context because it's like, it churns up all kind of thoughts about, how do white people talk to black people? How do black people feel about white people? All that stuff is churning around. So there are similarities, I guess. But I think they're not the same kind of movie.
Right, it's tonal, not thematic.
Exactly, yeah.
It's the sense that
See, you put it so much better. I've wasted 5 minutes of everyone's time.
I don't know. We're here to work together.
You just did it in 4 words.
We're here to work together.
It's tonal, not thematic. You don't need me here. You don't need me. I'll just go and water the plants.
True.
Can I get you some coffee? Maybe you've got some laundry that needs picking up, some dry cleaning.
Well, that actually, we'll talk about that after. George on Facebook would like to know, because, as we were talking about before, you've done so many films and worked on Broadway and on television. Which director have you loved working with the most?
Oh, well, that's one of those questions. It's a bit like, have you stopped kicking your dog? Whether you answer yes or no, you're screwed.
Which of your children is your favorite?
Yeah, which child is your favorite? None of them, actually. No. There's different directors. It's different strokes for different folks. Different directors work in different ways, but there are one or two that stick out as kind of, but it's all to do with personality. I mean, there are some directors I've worked with who really are as dull as dishwater socially, but are just brilliant at what they do.
Who are those people?
And there are some people who, are pretty good at what they do, but like you wouldn't dream of spending an evening with anyone else because they're just like, wonderful people. But I've been fortunate in as much as I've worked with all kinds of directors, and I have found, without mentioning any names, I have found that there's a certain energy with women directors that is very, very different from working with male directors. And that female energy, I don't know if it's, I don't know what it is necessarily. I wouldn't presume to understand it or analyze it, but I kind of prefer it.
All right. Well, you've just destined yourself for a career of working with female directors, which I think is a good thing.
Nothing wrong with that.
And just because I know so many people do this in high school and it's such a classic show, I just personally want to know, what was the best thing about playing Tevye? I mean, that is such an iconic role.
Oh, there was nothing wrong with playing that part, except being constantly reminded how just not good enough I was to play it. That was the thing. Every night, I mean, I did it for a year and I loved it. Don't get me wrong, I loved it. And every night I gave it everything I had, and every night I came off kind of going,
I'm no topo.
And it just reminded me of something that I always tell. I teach a little bit now, occasionally, and it always reminds me of what I tell young actors. I always say, never trust the actor that comes off stage and goes, nailed it. Man, I nailed it tonight. I had them right here. I had them in the, never happens. It never happens.
That's never happened to you once in your entire
Never once
career.
in my life.
Wow.
I've never come off thinking, yes, never. Every night I come out, moments worked. Yeah, that laugh came back tonight, or oh yeah, that was really good when you did that, and little moments work. But overall, you always come off kind of thinking, I've got to get that right. I've got to I mess that up, because it's organic. It's a living thing. It's not a there's no set. It's not like it's not like a diagram to how to fix how to build an electrical circuit. There's only one way of doing that properly. But acting in any form, stage or screen, it's a mishmash of it's the only industry. Let's face it, it's the only industry that's based on folly and caprice. So.
Maybe the stock market.
You got to start. You got to start there.
All right. Before we let you go, we are going to do our lightning round. This is where I ask you 5 questions very quickly. You're not to think too hard about your answer. You're supposed to answer.
This is when I always make a fool of myself.
Well, that is the plan.
You take some water first.
All right. Take a breath.
I wish it was gin.
It could be. They don't
Another
know.
miracle.
All right. What was the last show you binge watched?
Oh, the last show I binge watched, Gomorrah.
Oh, interesting. That didn't get a lot of traction here, but it got really good reviews.
It's fantastic.
And it's coming back, right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
All right. What show that you love so much would you want to sit and watch someone else enjoy for the first time?
Breaking Bad.
That is such a popular answer to that question. Yes. All right. If you
And anything I'm in.
Good. You got that right under the wire. All right. If you could go back in time and be on any classic television show, what show would you like to be part of?
Oh, Golden Girls, without a doubt. Without a doubt.
So wait, no, stop. So who would you play on Golden Girls? Like one of their boyfriends? Well, you would have been too young.
No, I'd have been one of their toy boys.
Which one?
Well, I can't. I want to say Betty White's toy boy, but I can't because Betty White played my mother in a TV series.
Oh yeah, no,
so that would be weird. So maybe I'd any of the others.
Rue McClanahan. I feel like
maybe Rue. Yeah, maybe Estelle Getty. Why not?
Exactly. Why not? All right. There's a whole new vision that I have now. All right.
Have I got? Do you like me a little less now? Is that what it is?
No, I actually think I like you a little more now. All right. So this is a tough one for you because you've done everything. Is there a genre that you haven't done that you would like to try?
Do you know what? I know it's too late now for me because I'm too old. But a beautiful kind of sort of period rom-com, sort of get all dressed up in nice sort of 19th century costumes and have a lovely kind of love scene with some interesting lady playing a duchess.
Okay.
But I'll never get that because I'd be like I'm going to tell you a wonderful story. I was talking to my daughter, and Downton Abbey was like, was like in everybody's. Everybody was talking about Downton Abbey, and my daughter actually introduced me to Downton, because she said, "Oh, Dad, there's this show on over here. You got to check it out when it comes over to America. It's really brilliant." And I started watching it, and I said, "Wow, that's really fantastic." And I said, "Yeah, what part do you think I'd have played if I was in that?" And before I could even suggest the Duke or any, my daughter goes, Carson.
Of course. But that would have been a good part for you.
Yeah, so.
Why weren't you on Downton Abbey?
Because I was here.
Go
I was
back.
here.
All right. Well, I
I
think
was talking to you.
I think I know the answer to this one now. Walter White or Tony Soprano?
Oh, Walter White.
Wow, Cranston is going to be so happy when he sees these. All right, and finally, do you remember your first professional acting job, and is there anything you learned on that job that you're still using now?
I do remember my first professional acting job. It was, do you want to know what it was?
Yeah.
It was doing a tour of schools, primary schools. So this was kids in for 8 to 12-year-old kids. Mm-hmm. We would do 2 shows a day, 2 schools a day, mm-hmm. and we toured around in a van, and we did a potted version of Midsummer Night's Dream, where we cut out all the lovers scenes and we just had the magic stuff and the mechanicals. And a sort of dramatized version of the Jungle Book. And we would take these shows, and different schools would choose one or the other. And we would tour around. And I think the thing I learned from that was never, ever underestimate an audience full of kids, because they are capable of anything.
And understanding and
they're a lot,
being attentive.
They're a lot smarter than you give them credit for, and they just don't. You know, if there's nothing more heartbreaking than being on stage in a room full of 8-year-olds and all you see is this. There's nothing worse.
I feel like being in a room full of people any age seeing that is
No,
probably bad.
adults. I think, you know, if I've seen people in the audience yawn when I've been on stage more than once, but if it's an adult, you think, oh, he's had a hard day.
Exactly.
Maybe a couple of martinis before the show. Doesn't really want to be here. Got dragged here by his wife. Maybe, I don't know. All kind. You rationalize everything.
Yes.
But an 8-year-old kid has got nothing in his or her life to distract him or her from this moment, and yet they're yawning.
Yeah.
You know, and you kind of go, it's a wonder I stayed in the business.
So have you ever encountered one of those 8-year-olds many years later saying, "Oh my God, you came to my school, and I saw you in the Jungle Book when I was 8 years old"?
I did once, and then he told me how he's just survived drug addiction and suicide attempts.
So
No, I'm
maybe
kidding.
you helped him too.
I'm kidding.
It's
I'm
a
kidding.
theme.
I'm kidding. No one. No, I've never had that joy of meet. I did meet someone, an actor. He's now a professional actor who came to see a play when he was 11 with his grandmother, and that was really fantastic because I was working with him, and he said, and I introduced myself. I said, "Hi, I'm Freddie." He said, "Oh, we've met before." And I said, "Oh, really? When?" He said, "Well, you know, when you were doing this musical, and I came backstage with my grandma." And I went, "Oh," and I remembered it because his grandma was somebody that I knew, and that was fantastic. You know,
Inspiring people everywhere you go. Maybe inspiring people today.
hopefully.
All right, I hope so too. Well, thank you so much for
Oh, this was
joining
fun.
us.
Thank
and
you.
thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank
Stay
you.
tuned. Gerard Carmichael will be chatting a little bit later.